Look at that vista, look at that impressive expanse, look at the stacked effects of Ultra Mega Bloom, Tri-Linear and Scoresling, Anti and Pro Aliasing, 40K super textures, expensive mocap studios well known on social media, actors, hundreds of millions spent on the most realistic graphics and human animations. The visual aspect of the game making art has never been at a technical level of excellence, quite like it is today. Only to make this abomination. These hideous models, this hard to look at filth, these light effects that are painful to look at, scenery so jumbled with visual noise. Every game today needs yellow paint to tell you where to go since developers no longer make intuitive vidya. Think about how stacked games are with tutorials, handheld, and garish visual cues. Fairies that tell you where to go, bracelets to tell you how to solve puzzles. Dev teams need these things to explain what to do at all moments, because they no longer have the ability to create a game that shows you what to do, where you can intuit where to go. There's a massive game in technical, mechanical skill and growth in engines and artistic computer programs that is directly inverse related to a loss in the ability to herd players towards both the main storyline and side quests or hidden treasures that was commonly a sign of developer skill. Developers are treating art design and the cinematic experience as if games are movies made for critics, spending ballooning budgets on making the game have the highest graphical impressiveness. Not only is this throwing money into the fire constantly, but is completely missing how visuals can be used to enhance gameplay. Movies, particularly the ones that are the inspiration, it seems, for a lot of modern cinematic gaming, such as the Marvel Cinematic Universe, are packed with details in every scene. There is so much action and non-stop stuff happening that is not necessarily important, is not meant to keep your eyes on something specific, but more to keep you always engaged. There is a difference. The MCU is like Cocomelon for adults. You can just turn your brain off and be awed by the spectacle. A game, however, is different for one specific reason. It's not enough just to be engaged. Gamers also are required to do something. And despite the regular excuses and blame being placed on players, it is not the job of the player to intuit what the developer wants them to do, but the developer to create a game that makes the player feel like they figured it out on their own. Art design as far back as the NES could be both beautiful and practical. If you take a look at an NES game, Super Mario Bros. 3 for example, it is still a very beautiful game to this day. It is colorful with enjoyable to look at pixels. You can tell information clearly. You don't have to be told when you come up to a turtle with a spike back that unlike a regular turtle or beetle, you cannot jump on it. The attack angle of the angry sun makes sense. You can see Bowser stomp once and know exactly how to beat him. Almost all enemies, hazards, power-ups are very visible and obvious at a glance. There is a background, foreground, and the platforms that are usable by Mario, and it is very clear what is what. The ground you can stand on has a clear outline. There is no point where you are confused on where enemies are, where Mario is, and even trickier things like projectiles are visually apparent. This was all possible on an 8-bit system. Yet now, we have 4K games where you need visually handholding to find where you are going, know where enemies are, know what platforming and climbing is possible. Treasures need spotlights. Modern isometric games, you will lose even where you yourself are. Projectiles vanish. Enemy telegraphs need to be overly obvious, yet still can be missed. In the cacophony of particle effects from the abilities and spells of yourself, allies, the environment, and so on. Games have lost the practical ability for visuals to give you information, so they have to rely on what is effectively a tutorial that lasts the entire game. Multiple games. And since almost all of them do these things the exact same way, of course, gamers are going to start to think they're manufactured in a lab instead of through a creative process. Gamers spent decades in well-designed games without needing arrows, yellow paint, annoying companions telling them how to solve every minor puzzle. The yellow paint everywhere strategy feels like a basic dev loadout they are trained in. But it is only the most obvious symptoms of what is a general inability to use visuals to enhance the game. So, when you play a supposedly varied games like God of War, The Last of Us 2, Spider-Man, Hellblade 2, Starfield, Horizon No Dawn, Dragon Age Veilguard, Star Wars Outlaws, Forspoken, insert cinematic AAA slop here, they all were made by the same group of people, with the same training, with the same game engine, with the same views. Factory made, straight off the assembly. If you were to look at the games made by the top studios 20 years ago, you'll not only see more creative ways of handling practicality, but a vast variety of character design styles. While now the obsession with realism means you can take 20 random characters from different Western studios, throw them in a game, and nobody would notice. Modern signposting feels bad both because it is artificial, and you are forced to notice it. It tells you, this is here because this is a video game. Visual design is supposed to mask this for immersion, and games are capable, with some thought of doing this, signposting in a natural way. In the real world, explorers will set up markers for guided paths and to show safe places. In a modern setting, we use clear indicators for dangerous areas, or to point people in the right direction, such as glowing exit signs, lane paint on roads, or to denote machinery or toxic materials. But when exploring a lost civilization, or in a medieval world, or on an alien planet, or in 100 other scenarios, it sticks out like a big yellow thumb. If you were to look at an eye tracker for 1,000 Renaissance paintings, you'd find almost every painting manages to direct people's eyes to specific focal points naturally, just by the artistic design. And sometimes, simple is best. In Dark Souls, the game frequently uses torches to draw your eyes to exits, and monuments, statues, or other notable features to entice you to treasures. Dark Souls 2, for example, is an area where you create your own signposts by lighting all the torches in the area. This is the same technique as the yellow paint, yet, because it is natural and fits with the world it's in, it doesn't detract from immersion, it enhances it. And torches is not some wacky 300 IQ choice nobody could ever think of. If you gave a clever person an hour with every yellow paint game, I guarantee they could think of something more natural and less game feeling. Now, it's very easy to say, why care about this? Why does it matter if there's some gamey, unimmersive elements? Menus aren't immersive. The UI is not immersive, true. But also think about a game that has a third of the screen filled with pop-ups, warnings, all sorts of information, versus a very tight UI that only gives you directly relevant info, and perhaps brings up more when it is relevant. You can never fully forget you are playing a game, but everything that adds up to drawing you out of what you are playing hurts it a little bit more. There's always going to be gamey features, every unnecessary reminder to gamers that this is a game, which you can remove or obfuscate in some manner, assists in entrancing players by what you have made, rather than how you have made it. Yellow paint is, purely, a practical element. If it did not fulfill a purpose, it would not be in any games, and that is undeniable. The point is to draw you to something, generally an exit or transition like a ledge, climb, or a ladder event. The goal is not to put in yellow paint. It is to get you looking at that point. And it is proven that you can do this in more natural ways. So, the natural conclusion gamers come to is that developers are being lazy. And in many cases, this is the correct conclusion. At least on this one thing, and there are exceptions. As an example, not all games are meant to immerse you or draw you into the world. For example, arcade games, such as racing, beat 'em up, or side scrollers, they may have a big yellow arrow saying, go here next. The goal of those games, first and foremost, is to keep the action moving non-stop. You are never slowing down and looking around scenery trying to figure things out. That is not the goal of the game. And because you are meant to figure out things like power-ups, incoming enemies, an upcoming sharp turn, a major enemy telegraphed attack, where to go to next at a single glance, it benefits the game experience for something like yellow paint or other obvious gaming mechanics to exist. An arcade game in context is meant to feel like a game, while a cinematic or immersive open world game is meant to draw you into the story or world. Think about how Deadpool 3 was full of fourth wall breaking quips, but if you did this in Logan, it would completely undermine the serious storytelling. As it stands, better visual capacity is creating more problems that artists are not addressing. As devices grow more powerful, developers put in more and more clutter. Foliage, grass, bushes, rocks, critters, urban clutter. Whatever it is, the screen is full of more and more stuff the stronger our devices get. 20 years ago, if you were to put a complex visual asset in your game, it would be the sign of a major dungeon or side quest or something very important. Now, you can litter a map with the same assets, and there is no thought or meaning or purpose behind them. In terms of practicality, think about this. Have you ever turned down graphics solely to see things better? So not for performance issues. An example would be turning down particle effects so you can see what is happening in combat. Even in games, where story immersion is secondary to gameplay, like an ARPG or an MMO, have you ever heard of someone complain about not being able to see the wasps in Diablo 3, or being unable to tell what's going on in a mythic raid in World of Warcraft? The clutter problem is one of their own making. It's easy enough to suggest to these companies to start using focal points like torches around a ladder, but if they have 1,000 torches sticking out of every crevice, you get the opposite problem. They simultaneously do not know how to use visuals to draw people's eyes to where they want them to go, and also have the issue of having too many visuals meant to draw people's eyes to certain points, which confuses their intuition. Angry Video Game Nerd complained about this very issue in his Silver Surfer review, an NES game, and many other games, especially shmups, where projectiles would constantly blend into the background, or it was hard to tell what was a harmless fore or background piece and what was often a very fatal wall that would destroy your ship. Just like a big red exit sign is useful for getting you out of a building fast in an emergency, if every single wall and door had a big red exit sign, it would make it very confusing and potentially even worse than not having any sign at all. And this is just as much an issue with modern visual design. They have created landscapes where normal signposts lead to nothing at all the time, so they need artificial signposts to override them. Teaching people bad habits can be a problem. Have you ever played a game that has completely held your hand the entire way, but then suddenly it stops and you get stuck? This is often used as an argument for why yellow paint is needed. Without it, people get stuck. But if anything, this is a sign of breaking expectations on how a game works. For example, we've all played games with a sudden vehicle or minigame segment where the controls are so different and unintuitive, you remember it as one of the most frustrating parts of an otherwise good game. Or the first time you play a game in a genre where controls are extremely uniform, like a first-person shooter, and everything is mapped completely differently. So why yellow paint? Even though it is regularly talked about, almost nobody is ever going to say they'll quit a game over it. It's like your favorite restaurant always playing the worst music you've ever heard. Even if it is annoying, you're there for the food. All the issues mentioned, like over-clutter, the impractical design, would remain in these games even if they removed the yellow paint. So when people say that this is a nitpick that does not matter, there's actually a grain of truth. It is rare that both the yellow paint alone would ever dissuade someone from enjoying a game. But it is also common that yellow paint means there are other issues that could help to erode your enjoyment. And it's simple. Yellow paint is a signpost. A signpost in the game to show you where to go, of course, as we have just been talking about, but also a signpost of the studio itself. Now, before you start bringing up all the games with yellow paint that you've enjoyed, think of it this way. Nobody ever quit their job because they got a paper cut. But everyone would quit their job if they were getting 100 paper cuts a day. All of this is just a small slice of what modern visual design is doing to make games feel worse to play. Before we even get into how visuals are used to preach the gospel of beauty-loathing modern audience creatives, this is already a situation of sameness, of repetition, of copying, and when you add incredibly shallow, obvious virtue signaling and ideology forced into every narrative, you get a combination of visuals and storytelling that constantly feels like it's the exact same thing as everything else. And even if you look past the visual clutter that is damaging the practical gameplay, you're creating beautiful graphics that are intrinsically ugly to almost everyone. And this starts to make games feel like they're just reskins of other games. If someone says Ubisoft open world, Well, what did you just think of? A bunch of obnoxious game mechanics that are extremely overused, and it feels like it's a paint-by-numbers game design, and developers, you need to realize everyone sees through this. If they didn't, nobody would ever be talking about it. Concord is a prime example of expensive ugliness. It's a game that managed to be both practically useless in the visuals and also ugly in the visuals, while at the same time having some of the most expensive visuals. When you look at the cinematics for the game, it is abundantly clear immediately. There is some serious technical skill and money behind the visuals, both in the game and the cinematics cutscenes. However, it does not capture anything players want. Characters move in a clunky, unpleasant way. The abilities and effects are bland and unhelpful for making split-second decisions. The character's silhouette is extremely muddied. Their design is not informative. You cannot look at every Concord character and immediately tell what their role is and how they will play. Whereas Overwatch and Marvel Rivals completely nails this just off of the visuals. So, despite being some of the industry's most impressive graphics, the visuals are extremely impractical and extremely ugly and unpleasant to look at. Yet, because this is tied directly to corporate ideology that pushes ugly women and weak men on gamers, both developers and journalists refuse to touch the elephant with a 10-foot pole. This needs to be made very clear. The modern audience signature look, that hurts any game it is in. Whether you are meant to buy cosmetics or you are meant to earn them in the game itself, nobody wants to, and this can be proven just by looking at the monetization success of extremely woke cosmetics versus so-called problematic cosmetics and appearances in games. Intentional ugliness is yellow paint for figuring out how much rot is in a studio. Corporate DEI is behind both hiring the people who make this and pushing out talented industry veterans at studios. But if they got rid of DEI today and stopped making games look ugly on purpose, there is still numerous other problems they would need to fix. It is a surface issue of a massive structural failure at AAA studios. You are spending hundreds of millions on making these games the most graphically stunning creations ever made, only to make them ugly, non-synergistic, or in some cases detrimental to the practical gameplay. And you are overspending on graphics with the goal of making people less interested in your game, like some sort of reverse marketing. Anyone could tell you this is a failing strategy. It'd be like spending $20,000 to buy the most expensive steak in existence, only to microwave it like a $2 steak. The audience for games so beautiful they require $5,000 PCs to appreciate, and the audience that wants a game so extremely ugly their political enemies will refuse to play it, these exist on different planes of existence, and you can simply not court both at the same time. The Sonic the Hedgehog movies have made $1 billion in theaters, now among the biggest video game movies ever made, and very well received to boot. But there's another universe where the studio heard all the backlash over ugly Sonic and said the exact same thing we hear journalists and game devs say all the time. They ignored fan feedback, they called the audience names, they said they weren't important. In that universe, there is no Sonic 2, there's no Sonic 3, just a single Sonic flop, dead in the water, with angry journalists calling people bigots for not accepting the ugly, weird-eyed, but extremely costly CGI hedgehog in the movie. Stop spending ungodly amounts of money to make the best-looking, ugly games ever.